Hey, welcome to another episode of the Speed Secrets podcast. Today's guest is a race engineer, Chris Andrews. Welcome to the show, Chris. Great to talk to you here.
Hey, great. Thanks for having me on.
Before we kind of jump into this, and I know a bit about your background and stuff like that, but tell listeners, give our listeners a little overview of your background in motorsport.
Sure. I've been racing for over 25 years now. Went to Purdue University, started off in Formula SAE there, and when I got out of college, growing up in Indiana, IndyCar racing was the thing to do. So I worked on a couple of IndyCar teams. I worked with AJ Foyt's team for a couple of years. And then I moved out to California and worked for Tom Gloy Racing as the engineer on the Trans Am team there with Ron Fellows, Dorsey Schrader, Boris Said, and had a really great time Trans Am racing in the mid and late 90s.
Man, you guys dominated there for a while.
Yeah, that was great racing and great cars. And then Tom Gloy, the team owner, had an opportunity to start a NASCAR truck team, which I was never really interested in NASCAR, but it was an opportunity to get into something new and kind of an upstart series. So Tom partnered with Bobby Rahal, and I moved from Sonoma to Mooresville, North Carolina, and a group of us started a NASCAR truck team. And honestly, we didn't really have a clue what we were doing when we started. We were a bunch of road racing guys that came NASCAR racing, but we learned a lot quickly, and we did that for a couple of years. And then as that was wrapping up, I had an opportunity to go to work as an engineer at Richard Childress Racing, which I had never even really heard of before. But it turns out Dale Earnhardt was their driver, and he was really good.
Yeah, I've heard of him.
So I got to spend a year and a half with him, and I stayed at RCR, worked my way all the way up to crew chief of the 31 car for a couple of years. I worked for Ray Evernham for a couple of years. Became technical director at Roush Fenway Racing's NASCAR program for 6 or 7 years. And then in the last handful of years, I've kind of gone full circle and I've returned to road racing, SRO GT4 racing and IMSA racing, Lamborghini Super Trofeo racing. And it's been a nice kind of return to a normal schedule and back to road racing for me. But my career's gone in a big circle, and I've worked with amateurs, professionals, rookies, millions and millions of dollar race winning championship guys, and I've seen a little bit of everything in that circle.
So this might be a little bit of an unfair question, but I'm curious. Do you have a preference, oval over road racing over oval, or any difference there? Any preferences?
I really don't have a difference or a preference. They're very different, and they're very different challenges. And the car setup, vehicle setup for the two are different, and driving requirements are very different for the two. And from a race car technical standpoint, I really enjoy the technical challenge of the car, working within or around the limitations of the rules, and helping a driver to get the most out of what he has to work with. And those things can be done in either venue. But I think maybe because I started off my career road racing, and then when I got to NASCAR racing, I had some success initially road racing, which kind of opened up some opportunities for some of the other things I did. And now that I've kind of circled back around to road racing, I don't know, maybe you could talk me into that being my favorite, but I enjoyed a lot of oval racing for a lot of years as well.
Well, and I guess that's one of the things about the NASCAR world is what are they doing, like 36 races a season or something like that? And, at least with road racing, there tend to be fewer races over the course of a season. So it's not quite as hectic, I guess. But
Yes. Last year with Volt Racing, with Alan Brynjolfsson and Trent Hinman, we did the SRO GT4 schedule and the IMSA GS schedule, which I think was 22 races that we did last year. And some of the guys on the team were like, man, 22 races. Like, we did 2 whole series this last year. That was a busy, busy year, which it was a busy, busy year. But for the last 20 years, I've been doing 36 race weekends a year.
Yeah.
So I was like, are there any more that we could do? Is there anywhere else we can go? But yeah, it's the road racing schedule these days is definitely a little bit more time at home.
Eh, And, like looking at your history and what you've done, I mean, you've won the Daytona 500, right?
Uh, I didn't win it single-handedly.
Well, no,
I was
yeah, you weren't driving. I know that. Yeah, yeah.
right. No, I was the technical director at Roush Fenway for 6 years, and in 2009, Matt Kenseth won the Daytona 500. So that was awesome to be a part of. Yes. Um,
So working with guys like that, I mean, Matt Kenseth and, you mentioned Dale Earnhardt and, that level of NASCAR driver. I think, I mean, there's a lot of road racing people, who believe that NASCAR, they turn left, they drive around in circles. How hard can that be? And I've had the experience of, and I know you've worked with Bill Elliott, and years ago I spent a day with him at the track, and I was just blown away by how good his car control was. How do you respond when a road racer goes, NASCAR, they just turn in circles?
well, I mean, for 33 weekends of the year, they're right. They do just go in circles, but on any given weekend, I would say at a NASCAR event, there's 36, 40, there's 40 cars in the race. The top 12, top 15 are capable of winning every week. And if you look at the qualifying results on Saturday afternoon, the top 12, 15 cars will do a lap around a mile and a half track within I mean, I haven't looked lately, but certainly within a half a second of each other. And a lot of times the top 10 will be within a couple tenths of each other. And they time them to the thousandth of a second.
Yeah.
So it's, and in road racing, for example, you see a guy in the pole, a guy in second will be 3/10 off him. The guy in third might be 3/10 off him. And by the time you get to 10th, it's a second and a half or 2 seconds. So, yes, they only turn left, and it's only a mile and a half, and in some cases it's only a half a mile. But the cars are restricted, and regulated so closely that it's like thousandths of a second between amongst the top five guys, and so it looks easy watching it on TV, but the amount of car control and what those guys can do in a half a mile or a mile and a half, depending on where they are. It's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I would say my experience is those guys, their outright car control is as good or better than anybody. And I'm throwing rally drivers into that same comparison. I think, it's just their ability to control a car at the very limit and have the thing move around. I think that's the one thing that doesn't show up on TV very well is how much those cup cars move around at a place like even like Daytona or Talladega or something like that, right?
It does. That does not translate well to television, but one of the things that has translated well, and this is to me, this is an interesting phenomenon, is 15 and 20 years ago, the NASCAR teams went to Sonoma once a year. They went to Watkins Glen once a year. And 15 or 20 years ago, a lot of those guys didn't even care about those races. They were like, we're going to go there. We're going to not crash. We're going to do the best we can. And if we come home 15th, on to the next race. Right?
Yeah.
And then, there was a time where Jeff Gordon got to be really good at that. And then Tony Stewart got to be really good at that. And a lot of the NASCAR drivers hired guys like Ron Fellows or Boris Said to be driver coaches to teach them how to do that. And then the NASCAR teams started to build very purpose-built road course cars for those two events. Yeah. And then I got to work with Robbie Gordon in 2003, and we won Sonoma and Watkins Glen in the same year. So that was like a really fun challenge I got assigned to work on, and I'm really proud of that. But when you watch the NASCAR cars on the road courses now, you can really see the car control. Yeah. Because it's a 3,400 pound car on 10-inch wide tires with 700, 800 horsepower, and they're big, heavy cars. You can see those guys throw the car around car control. And interestingly, now 15, 20 years later, after they didn't even care about those races, the road courses are some of the most popular NASCAR races of the year.
Yeah.
So much so that they've added one at Charlotte. So now there's 3 road courses a year. And I think the Xfinity Series does maybe 5 road courses in a year. So it's gone from being something that the drivers didn't even care about to being some of the most popular races, and the ones, to your initial point, the ones where you can actually see the car control.
Yeah, it's really cool. And you make a good point of, they're, what are they, 3,400 pounds and 10-inch tires. I mean, that's why they move around so much. I actually think, I always talk about, people that do track day events and they go and buy a new Porsche GT3 with these massive sticky tires on it, and the cars never move around. It's like, you should go and drive something, a NASCAR Cup car. That you'd really learn how to drive at the very, very limit. So
yeah. There are many more capable cars available now to do track day kind of stuff, amateur racing, entry level pro racing and stuff. It's a lot easier in today's era to get into a capable, comfortable to drive car than it was 10 or 20 years ago.
And possibly too easy.
Maybe. It's made for a really good industry though, and there's a lot of people that enjoy it as a hobby, but it may be too easy in some instances, yeah.
Well, and I think accessible, is fantastic and easy that way, but part of my thing is if you drive a car that moves around and slides around a lot, you develop that car control skill more and you become a better driver than if you're driving a car that's very, very capable and does 90% of the work for you.
Yeah. I've spent the last year and a half working on Porsche Caymans, like I said, with Volt Racing and also with GMG Racing out in California. And the Cayman it's a super capable car, but it's not on the top of the horsepower food chain,
right?
I guess.
Yeah.
And that's a car that you have to be very efficient with. You have to maintain your corner speed. You have to not scrub off speed, because when you get to the straightaway, there may be guys in other cars with more power that will drive by in a straight line.
Yeah.
Right. Which is kind of fun for a new guy to go fast in a straight line, but the Cayman, for example, is a car that rewards executing the corners properly, and that translates to lap time, rather than just slow down, go around the corner, and then step on the gas and go straight really fast.
Yeah, I don't think you or I have ever gotten into drag racing too much.
No.
Yeah.
And oddly, I've never really driven a race car.
Yeah. So
people have asked me for 25 years, oh, do you like to drive? Do you drive? Do you ever drive? I'm like, it's not really what I do best.
So how do you relate to a driver then? And I don't mean that in a, well, how could you ever do that? But because I think I know some engineers who have not spent a lot of time or any driving on a track, and yet they can relate. And then other engineers who don't ever seem to be able to relate to the driver.
That's a good question. This will sound corny, but I have spent a lot of time looking at data. Kind of as I was moving up through the ranks as an engineer, I spent a lot of time as a data acquisition guy, and even going back to Trans Am racing, we had Ron Fellows, Dorsey Schrader in the 2 factory cars. We had Boris Said and Brian Semo kind of in our customer cars to start. And Ron and Dorsey, they always wanted to overlay data to compare to each other to see where each other was beating the other. But then that would make them better, because they would kind of take the best of what they did and they might pick up something from the other. And then, when Boris started out, and with Brian, for example, that they were not as fast as Ron or Dorsey, but they could sit down and look at the data and see, they're faster there, they're faster. They could go out and do it. So the first way I learned how to relate was by looking at the data and just seeing what they like. It's kind of like watching if you've looked at enough data, it's kind of like watching a movie of what somebody is doing. And when you get to look at enough of it, you can start to pick out things that look good and things that don't. And so I kind of relate to that. And then in NASCAR racing, there's not a lot of data available. And you see all the crew chiefs and a lot of the engineers, they stand up on the roof of their transporter and they watch the car drive around. When you watch enough cars, you can see who's faster and slower, and you can see who's making a bigger arc into a corner and who's shallow, and you can see who has, who's unwinding their hands off the corner. You can see who's pinching off a corner just by watching. And so between studying the data and relating that to a driver and watching the car, kind of relating that to what he says, I guess I've kind of put all those things together fairly well.
Yeah, that's cool that you talk about because there is times that you can look at the squiggly lines in the data traces and you go, I know what the driver's doing. And sometimes you can almost go, I think I know why he or she is doing that.
Yes. And you can see, simple things, a driver applies brake pressure, they're coming off the brake pressure, and then as they're coming off the brake pressure, you see them stab the brake pressure one more time. Yep. And you can ask them, why, like something in your brain or your butt is making you apply a little bit more, like you're on your way off the brakes and you're back on, you're back off. And sometimes they'll say, oh, well, yeah, that's because it doesn't turn very well there, and I have to give it a little more brake to set the nose to make it turn. Okay, well, I can work on making it turn better now. Thank you for explaining that. But you kind of have to look in the data for that clue, right? Where another guy might say, yeah, I'm on the brakes, I'm coming off the brakes. Oh, and the back is getting ready to come out from under me, so I got to like whoa it down a little bit more. Okay, well, that's the exact same thing in the data, that one guy is doing it in one car for one reason and another guy's doing it in another car for another reason. But unless you ask them the reason, you don't know what to try to fix.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not for me, it's not so much like looking at the data and finding what to do. It's like looking at the data to find clues to what to talk to the driver about.
Yeah. Because the data show or generates better questions, doesn't it?
Yeah. And there's some guys that might say, oh, I didn't know that I was doing that. I'll stop doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And then they go out and they quit doing it and they go faster because they've just like eliminated a little pulse on the brakes. And you're like, oh, okay, well, that was easy.
Yeah. And I always think drivers don't just go, oh, I think I'm going to give the brakes another little stab. Like they don't just do it. I'm going to do that for fun. No, something's telling the driver to do that, whether it's too much speed or not enough turning or whatever, right?
Yes, yeah.
So it's interesting. Or sometimes it's just they're unaware of a bad habit they've gotten.
Yeah.
And so that shows up. So I'm curious, as an engineer, how do you handle a driver that you look at the data and you kind of go, I know that's not helping anything, but the driver goes, well, that's just the way I drive, and that's my style, kind of like, and I'm going to stick with it. How do you handle that?
Well, there's a couple of different, I guess, environmental things I would consider in that kind of instance. One of the things that I've really enjoyed for the last few years is working with some of the pro-am driver pairings that I have. And Alan and Trent in the Volt car, to me, are a great example of this. Alan has made a lot of progress in a few years as an amateur driver, and he's really fast. And one of the things that he does really well is he and Trent review their data after every practice. And then every practice, Alan has 2 or 3 things that he's going to work on. And he does not have any of what you just described, right? But he also has a pro driver that's his teammate that is clearly faster than him, that can tell him, you need to do this, and you will go faster. And when he does it, he does. So he sees the work that he's doing. He sees what Trent is teaching him. He applies it. He goes faster. Now, in a single car team, to your example, when you have a driver like that, I have before, and I think some of this comes with my background and experience. I have been able to tell stories or relate things to guys like, you know, so and so that I used to work with kind of did that too. But if you can make this adjustment, you don't, a driver doesn't ever want, there's a lot of ego involved in the sport,
Oh, really?
right? And,
Yeah.
and as soon as you get a race car, you are now a race car driver. And, um, it is, to your point, it's easier to work and coach and tune with some than others. But I mean, the answer to your question kind of comes, I think, from delivery and maybe from having even some experience in a different situation that you can relay to them might help make the point or drive some some suggestion home.
Right.
And some guys, this is a real phenomenon as well. If you can go to a track day that's a 2 day event, like a 2 day track event or a race weekend that spans 2 or 3 days, you might practice on the first day and you might get to look at some data or some video or talk about some things, think about some things, try a little different technique here or there, go home and sleep on it, and come back to the track the next morning and be better just because you left, you ate dinner, you went to sleep, you laid in bed, and you thought, well, maybe I should try. Maybe if I do this instead of that, and then come back the next morning kind of with a clear head, a fresh slate, and and it and it clicks.
Yeah.
There's sometimes it just takes time and practice and
Yeah. For years, while I was coaching driver, still obviously coaching drivers, but, a lot of times the driver would get to a certain lap time and I'd say, tomorrow morning you'll be half a second quicker. And they're like,
yes,
well, why? And it's like, because you're going to go to sleep. And
yes,
last year or the year before, whenever it was, I had, this Dr. Matthew Walker on my podcast, who's a sleep researcher who just happens to be a car motorsport fanatic as well. And he wrote a book, Why We Sleep. And he talked about the science behind what goes on when we're sleeping. And there's a certain point in our sleep or a certain time in our sleep, where everything that we learned in a day sort of becomes more solid. It's cemented. It's part of our programming. And if we don't get that bit of sleep, that bit of learning that happened during the day doesn't really have the same impact.
Doesn't get cemented.
So, just the whole, just experience. I'm sure you've had the same thing with a driver to come back the next day and they're a little quicker. Well, yeah, they've had time to think about it, but really there is some science and research behind why that happens. And actually that book is fantastic. It explains the different levels of sleep and when that happens. And probably about the only bad news is that if you have a really restless sleep because you're nervous about the next day, that might not happen.
Sure.
Yeah.
That kind of also then that also shows up in drivers that have long careers, right? I mean, you just have more opportunities to go to the track, learn something, go to sleep and cement it and come back the next day. And I'm sure you've seen too with drivers, the first time you go to a racetrack, the first time you've ever been to Watkins Glen, for example, you're not going to nail it on the first day.
Right.
But you'll get better on the second day and the third day. And then if you race there later that year, you'll be better. All right. And then if you race there again the next year, you should be better. And as you return to places and as you do things more often, every time you go, you improve a couple things, you learn a couple things that you need to improve. And what you want in a race car driver or race team, whether it's a professional driver or a hobby track day guy, like, you always want to be getting better. You always want to be learning something. You always want to, at the end of the day, be better than you started. Right?
Yeah. And as we're talking, I'm starting to kind of think, when you first start going to races or track day stuff, you don't sleep very well because you're nervous. It's all new. You're anxious.
Yeah.
And, all the pro drivers that I work with, you're like, how'd you sleep? Great. You kind of get so much experience that it's not such a anxiety producing thing that you actually get better sleep. So maybe that helps contribute to you learning more at that point too.
Mm-hmm.
So
A great, an interesting insight that I had seen this in lots of drivers before, but I'd never heard it explained to me this way. But Carl Edwards told me that when he first got into NASCAR racing, it took all of the effort he had to just go fast, and he was just hanging on to go as fast as he could go. And then, like when the engineers and the crew chief started asking him what the car was doing, he didn't know because he was putting 100% of his capability into just hanging on and going fast. He said, and then when he got comfortable with the speed, he could kind of start paying attention, like, I'm going pretty fast, and the front doesn't turn as much as I would like to, especially after I hit that bump. And then he could describe that to the crew chief or the engineer, and they would work on that. And then he got to where you'd have to run 40 laps on a set of tires before the pit stop another set of tires. So then he would have to drive as fast as he could. He would have to pay attention to what the car was doing, and he would have to manage the tires for 40 laps because you don't want to burn them up too quick, or you don't want to have tire left over when you do your stop. And then he said he got to be pretty good at that. Then you kind of think about managing the race and how you got to get from the beginning of the race to the end of the race over 6 or 8 pit stops, managing your tires and your track position and pushing at the right time and maintaining the car at the right time, all while telling them what it's doing, And then he said, at his peak, he said there's times in races where he's going as fast as he can. He's radioing in what the car's doing. He's managing the tires. And you can see like 3 or 4 cars up ahead, somebody's left rear tire sidewall looks like it has a ripple in it, and they might have a tire going down. And then 4 laps later, that car blows a tire and crashes. But you've gotten to like such a level where your brain is like taking all that stuff in and doing all the things that you have to do to be competitive at that level. But he said that didn't come overnight. He said it took me a lot, like every step of the way. It took a while to get ready for the next thing. It's competing at that level is much more than just driving fast.
And yet we think of guys like that as overnight successes.
Yeah. No, it took him a long time to get to where he was. There are drivers that are naturally gifted that can just jump in a car and go fast, but rarely does somebody just jump in a car, go fast, and win the championship in their first year.
Yeah.
It takes years of working with the good people, kind of guide you down a path, and you learn from everybody that you work with throughout your career to get to be, hugely successful.
Yeah. So you've worked with some really amazing drivers. Who are some of your favorites, I guess, and why?
That's a good question. I think Robbie Gordon. Robbie's a good friend of mine, and Robbie. A lot of controversy surrounding Robbie, and he's certainly a hothead, and he has gotten into a lot of confrontations with a lot of people along the way. But he's probably the most naturally gifted guy that I have worked with. He would go race his Baja 1000 truck and then fly directly to Homestead and be there Friday morning for practice, and we could be in the top 10 of NASCAR practice. And throughout the month of May, he would drive the IndyCar in Indianapolis. He'd come to Charlotte, and we would be competitive there in May. So from a naturally gifted, just, wow, that guy is awesome behind the wheel, certainly he's high on my list. And I'll tell you, when I went to work at RCR, I was a little bit intimidated, maybe, working with Dale Earnhardt because, like, for God's sakes, he was Dale Earnhardt,
Yeah.
And when they realized I had some road racing experience, I went to Sonoma with the team, which is a separate story. But then later in the year, we went to Watkins Glen to test. And one of the things that I used to do I still do this sometimes, but I learned something on this day. Is the morning of the test, we drove around the racetrack. We talked about Watkins Glen, and then I sat down with a track map and I said, "Hey, I said, let me ask you this. I said, where on the track to you are the really good passing places?" Because in my past, I would always try to concentrate on corners. Like if you had to make a trade off, concentrate on a corner that leads to a passing zone
Mm-hmm.
because those are the places where you'll make progress in the race. And so Dale grabbed the map and he was like, well, right here, the last corner, you come off the last corner, you go by start finish. He said, you can pass into one. He said, then you right around the corner here, all the way up through the S's, you want to stay close to a guy. He said, the chicane here, he said, you can pass here, sometimes here. He said, then here, you want to stay over here because there's an opportunity here. He said, this corner, people overlooked us, but you want, if you can position yourself here, right? And he's like, well, he said, the whole thing is a passing opportunity. And I was like,
Yep.
oh, okay, yeah, sure. That's Dale Earnhardt. Like that guy will pass anywhere, anytime the opportunity presented itself, you know?
Yeah.
And I was like, geez, I thought like I was really smart with my approach of concentrating on the passing zones, but this six-time champion just explained to me that they're all passing zones.
Right. Right.
Right? Right? So he was he was fun to work with, and on Trent Hinman, for example,
Yeah.
in the Volt car, last year's GTD champion as well. Um, Young guy, like half my age, young guy, super talented, super professional, super nice guy, a great coach for Alan. Their personalities go well together. They're great teammates, and on occasion, they'll be looking at data, and then Trent will come to me and he'll go, "Alan is beating me in turn 4." And I'm like, well, how? He's like, I don't know. I kind of thought I was going through there as fast as I could go, but he's doing something, there. And then next session, Trent would go out and he would go faster in turn 4. And, so there's a guy who's won a lot of races, won the GTD championship. He's the pro driver coaching Alan, but he's also not too proud to see in the data, there's a place where I can go faster, right? And then do it. So I have a lot of respect for, I'll say all the drivers that I've worked for, but, some for different reasons than others.
Yeah. Yeah. So just for pure entertainment value, funny story about one of your guys that you've worked with.
A funny story about one of the guys I've worked with. Okay, I'm gonna tell you maybe the funniest story I have. And this was January of 2000. We had been, Dale Earnhardt was spectacular at the restrictor plate races, Daytona and Talladega, and that Daytona 500 is obviously a big event. So we worked, in the wind tunnel on our speedway cars all winter, and we went to Talladega to test. And this was going to the racetrack. This was going to be the first time. This is not racetrack related either. This is off track. Funny story.
Yeah.
Talladega test, January of 2000. This was the first time I had met Dale Earnhardt. So we get to the racetrack. We get everything all set up. I'm the data guy, so I check out my Pi V4 system, and I go out and I put the beacon at the start-finish line, and I got my shock sensors calibrated on the setup pad, and we're all ready to go. Guys warm up the car. Dale shows up like right before 9 o'clock. And he gets in the car at 9, and he stayed in the car until noon. I mean, we just changed things and ran laps. And I'm downloading data, and I never really got introduced to him. He's just the race car driver. So we test until noon. We take a break. Everyone eats lunch. Right before lunch, I can't believe I'm telling you the story on a podcast. So right before 1 o'clock, track goes green at 1, and I'm like, man, I'm going to use the restroom. So I go down to the end of the garage, and the restroom has like one of those long stainless steel urinals on the wall, and I walk in and I walk up to the urinal and I'm peeing in the urinal. And I hear the door swing open and shut. And like in my peripheral vision, it's Dale.
Uh-huh.
And he walks up and he stands shoulder to shoulder with me. Okay, now this urinal is 20 feet long.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and we're the only two people in there. And he's like right next to me. And he unzips his driving suit and he starts peeing. Right? Which, I mean, first of all, for guys, it's almost a awkward situation, right? So, he says, "What's the matter? You cold?" And I'm like, "No." And I'm trying to finish, And he says, "You sure you're not cold?"
Uh,
And I'm like I'm thinking, like, "No, I'm not cold. No, no, I'm not cold." Like, you're standing there, two guys peeing at the urinal, and like, what is he looking at? And I'm like, "Pee faster, pee faster, pee faster." He goes, "You're sure you're not cold?" And I'm like, "No, I'm good." And I zip up and I go over and I wash my hands. And I'm like, I'm just wanting to get out of there at this point, And I'm going towards the door, and he says, I asked because you're wearing that sweatshirt, and it was kind of chilly this morning, but it's like 80 degrees now. You could probably take your sweatshirt off. And I was like, oh, yeah, thanks. And I walk out the door, and I was like, oh my god, I was like, heart stopping, So then when I got out, he walked down and he like slapped me on the shoulder. He was like, "Oh man, I was just giving you a hard time, I'm Dale," and we talked, and that was the day I met him. And yeah, you don't want to be standing at a urinal when the guy asks you if you're cold. It's just like,
yeah. But it does prove that I guess he was human too.
oh, he was a great guy. He was like, I mean, he would crack jokes and all that stuff. And then when it was time to put on the glasses and the hat and go be the intimidator, he was the intimidator, and he won a lot of races. And
Yeah.
I learned a lot from him in a short time. And yeah, that was good stuff.
And I'm curious about one of the things that I think the best drivers do is they're really good at building the team around them. Was that part of it? In a strange way, in a funny way.
Yeah, he wanted to know that everybody on the team was, all in and all. And since I alluded to this, I'll tell you this Sonoma story too. So I did not travel with the team every weekend. I was like the stay-at-home and the test engineer.
Yeah.
And they were getting ready to go to Sonoma. And Kevin Hamlin, the crew chief, came into the engineering office, which is like a little room on the side of the paint and body shop, because engineers in NASCAR racing in 1999, 2000, that was like a new thing. So Kevin Hamlin comes in and he says, "Hey, I know you used to do some of that road racing stuff, and I know you used to live out in Sonoma. So if you want to come to Sonoma and help, I would really appreciate it, And I was like, man, that would be awesome. Okay. So we fly out to Sonoma. We go to the racetrack in the morning and get to the track. And I'm like, what can I do? Kevin was like, well, sit tight. So right before practice, he hands me a radio and a headset, and he says, go out to turn 7. And if anybody crashes out there, tell Dale that somebody's crashed in 7. There's a wreck in 7, something like that. Other than that, that's all we need.
Huh.
And I was like, oh, well, okay. I mean, I was kind of disappointed that that's all they asked me to do, but so out to turn 7 I go. And I stood out there for 2 hours practice, and we were not very good in practice. We were like 35th or something terrible. And then he went out and qualified like 38th or something, and everybody on the team was like kind of in the dumps because he had run well at Sonoma before, and just not a good day at the track. So we go back to the hotel, we have dinner. Kevin, crew chief, calls me. I come into his room and he says, man, we got to do something better tomorrow. He said, because that was awful. I was like, yeah, that was not good. He said, well, what would you do? And I said, well, I truck raced here last year. The truck is kind of similar to the car, and we ran a really big rear sway bar and really soft rear springs, and we did this and this. He was like, oh, Dale does not like rear sway bars. I was like, okay, well, I mean, he doesn't like being 38th either, but right, you asked me and I'm telling you. He's like, okay, well, we'll see what Dale says tomorrow. So we go to the track Saturday morning, And we're standing there drinking coffee, and Dale comes in the back door. Kevin and I are standing there, and he says, "So, train driver, what do you think we should do?" Which was like the engineer joke back then, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah.
And I said, well, I said, Kevin asked me last night. I said, here's what I would do. I would, like, we have no rear sway bar on the car. It's flopping around all over the place. We've got to have some kind of rear bar and probably some softer rear springs to go with it, maybe this and that. And he looks at Kevin. He's like, what do you think, Kevin? And Kevin says, I don't know. We can't be any worse. You know, so Dale's like, okay, let's try it. So the guys get to work. They change all this stuff on the car, getting ready for practice. Kevin hands me my radio, and he's like, go spot again. I was like, okay, and off I go. And practice starts. And this was back when they had second round requalifying. Okay. So I'm out there, and I'm standing in the tall weeds, you know, watching for a crash in turn 7. Dale goes out, and the car looks way better. It's flatter. It's driving off the corner better. And I hear the lap times in my ear, and he's going faster than he qualified the day before. And he runs 5, 6, 7 laps, you know, and he comes in, and Kevin says on the radio, he says, hey, you know, what do you think? He says, man, it brakes better. It's more stable. It doesn't roll over so much. The tires are all on the ground. It has good forward drive. He says, what do you think we should do now, Chris? And I'm like standing out there in the tall weeds, you know, and he's, Chris, are you on the radio? And then I was like, holy cow, he's talking to me. Like, and I didn't even know that he knew my name at this point. You know? I was like, well, you know, and I pressed the button. I was like, hey, if that was better, we could try a little bit bigger rear bar. And we could, he's like, okay, yeah, let's do that. So we did that, and he got better again. And they had second round qualifying. He qualified 26th, which was like 12 spots better than the day before. And I think that he started 26th, and I think we finished like 5th or 6th that day. Wow. And you know, and I was like, dang it, at the beginning of the day, I didn't even know. He called me train driver. I didn't even know if he knew my real name.
Right.
You know? But then later in the year, leading up to Watkins Glen, and Dale was at the shop on Tuesdays, he actually came to my desk in the engineering office, and he was like, hey, you're coming to Watkins Glen with us, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, absolutely. You know? And that's, you know, another example kind of learning. Like, you can always learn something from someone, and you're never done learning. You know, like when Kevin told me, oh, Dale doesn't like rear sway bars. I was like, well, he doesn't like being slow either. Right. So, you know, and then I mean, after that, he knew my name after that. I really enjoyed that. Those are my two Dale Earnhardt stories right there. Yeah. Sonoma, Watkins Glen, and 3 and 10 Talladega.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And what a, you know, just an life experience for you to be able to spend time working with a guy like that. Because it's so cool to see what the very, very best do. Kind of taking this down a notch in a way, or maybe not down. That's maybe unfair in a way. But, you know, so many people listening to this podcast are, you know, they're the driver. They're the engineer. They're the transport driver. They're the team manager. They're the mechanic. And they're also the sponsor. So they get to the track, and they're now, you know, they're going like, I want to go quicker.
Sure.
Do you where would you tell a guy like that to start? Where do they even start? And obviously you can't get into, you know, shock settings and springs and all that, but is there kind of a general philosophy that you have in terms of tuning a car's handling to make them better?
Well, I guess I would say, like, from the beginning, right? Regardless of what series you're in, you can't necessarily buy speed, but everyone has a budget for whatever equipment they have, right? You want to have the best equipment you can have at any point in time. Okay. Then, not everybody gets to have data acquisition systems and driver coaching, you know, and all of that stuff. But I'm sure there's a lot they can learn from your podcasts. I know that there's plenty of good books out there and like kind of fundamentals of performance driving, but make sure they're doing all the fundamentals correctly. You know, anybody can go buy a set of golf clubs and go to the golf course and be whacking balls on a golf course, right? I honestly, I've played golf once in my life, and I don't because I'm not very good at it, and I don't have enough time to spend to get good at it. But anybody that's out there whacking golf balls, can have someone kind of watch them and say, put your feet like this, put your hips kind of like this, hold it kind of like this, and they'll be better because those are fundamentals, right? And there are fundamentals to driving, driving line, knowing where the apexes are, knowing where to track out, the proper way to apply the brakes and use them, proper way to apply throttle. So I would say make sure you understand what the fundamentals are. Like, don't just get in and drive as fast as you can until you're scared, because that's kind of like whacking golf balls,
Right.
right? But you need to know the fundamentals, and you need to execute those. Once you feel like you're doing those, then there's probably some benefit to even just putting a video camera in your car, over your shoulder, looking at your hands, looking out the windshield. And, when you're out there running laps by yourself, things are happening pretty fast. And I don't think a lot of guys necessarily remember what happened.
Yeah.
When you go back and watch video of yourself driving, which is a fairly inexpensive investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
Be like, oh, I never even got to that apex down there. Like, I never got to the peak of the turn. Or, coming off the corner, there's I don't feel like there's a lot of room running off that corner, but I'm 3 feet from the curbing and I could track out farther there, right? Or get behind some guys in similar cars that are faster than you and follow them and watch what they do. That's free. That's like free education.
Yeah.
If you can put yourself, and on a track day, there's probably opportunities to do that, right?
Yeah.
But just some basic video, and going back and rewatching it, you can learn a lot about yourself. And then you get to things like driver coaching and having someone watch that video with you or watch what you're doing that can give you pointers, or maybe drive your car for you and lay down a faster lap. And then you can kind of watch the video and see what you do and what they do, right? And then kind of from a budget standpoint, you move up to things like a basic data acquisition system, throttle, steering, brakes, and speed. With those, add to that usually like an accelerometer. But I mean, you add 4 or 5 basic data acquisition things, or like a V-Box system, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, the amount that you can learn about what you're doing yourself, or if you have a driver coach or partner, the amount that you can learn from each other, right? So to me, it starts off with having capable equipment, the best you can afford or are willing to afford, knowing what the fundamentals are, right? And then executing those to the best of your ability. And then you kind of get to tools to help you do a better job. And that's, I think the video stuff, especially as far as technology has come, and I know you've been doing this a while too, but I mean, I remember the data acquisition systems we had in those Trans Am cars in the mid 90s.
Yeah.
I mean, you can do everything we did back then pretty much on your phone now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But even a basic, I mean, if you have a $10,000 or $15,000 race car and you buy a couple of thousands of dollars worth of tires a year for track days, and I've not even looked lately, but I'm sure you could do that kind of data acquisition stuff for $1,000 or less at this point.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's the amount that you can learn from that. It's huge.
Right.
So that would be kind of my progression for how to do that if I were going to do it.
Yeah. Well, that's cool advice. And speaking of advice, so to kind of wrap up the podcast here, and I'll let you get back to your engineering work. Your speed secret, your single piece of advice for drivers.
It is kind of based on all of those stories that I told you, and I could tell you countless more on another podcast.
Yeah, and we will.
Is to never stop learning about never stop learning, period. Okay. And that can apply to never stop learning about your vehicle and how it works. Never stop learning about different techniques and what might produce different results than what you're doing. Never stop learning about setup stuff, to the Dale Earnhardt story that however you have your car set might not be the best way. Never stop learning about, data and things you see in data. Never stop learning about your, bad habits or limitations and what you can do better. But yeah, that's my speed secret would be, and this applies to engineers, and also to drivers, is just to never stop learning about what you're doing because that's how you get better.
So, bonus question, because I get asked this a lot, is, a driver will say, what's the best book I can read that'll give me a good, solid understanding of tuning the handling of my car? And I usually, it's like, I kind of go, well, everybody should read Carroll Smith, Tune to Win, Prepare to Win, Engineer to Win books. I mean,
Yes.
you got to start, everybody should read those. Is there, what, if I said, which book should somebody read? Do you have a resource there?
Everybody, it's a bonus question, and I don't know if I'm going to get bonus points for copying your answer. But
Okay.
those Carroll Smith books, I bought them when I was in college in the early '90s, building a Formula SAE car,
Yeah.
and I read them like they were the Bible, and they really still are.
Yeah.
The fundamentals of vehicle dynamics, like the laws of physics, they've not changed,
Funny that.
right? And people have asked me, like, wow, you've worked on a lot of different cars and a lot of different series, and road racing and ovals and all that stuff. But I mean, a car's got four tires. They got to be pointed in a certain direction. It's got a CG that's some height off the ground, and the car's going to roll over some amount. It's got some horsepower and torque and some gear ratios. It's got brakes, and it's got some amount of downforce pushing it down and some amount of drag pulling it backwards, right? That's every car I've ever worked on has had those things.
Yep.
And the fundamentals, kind of like the fundamentals of golf or the fundamentals of vehicle dynamics, kind of entry level basic stuff, just involves those things. Now, you can branch off into like details of suspension geometry and tuning dampers and wind tunnel development of your aero platform, all that stuff. But the fundamentals are all covered in those Carroll Smith books.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I was moving stuff around my home office last week, and I moved into a new house about 3.5 years ago, and I have a couple of boxes here that I had not even unpacked in 3.5 years. And when I opened one of them up the other day, the Carroll Smith books were in there. And I also include on that list Paul Haney's Inside Racing Technology book.
Yep.
Has a little bit more modern application of some of the same things. But I opened that box up and I was like, oh man, I love those books.
Yeah.
Like that's, 30 years into my racing career, I don't read them anymore. But I still look at them and I'm like, oh, that's where it all started. Like that's like race car 101.
It's funny how on my bookshelf I'm sitting here right now and I look over there and there's Paul Haney's book and there's Carroll Smith's book and and there's something about looking at them and I kind of go, oh yeah, that reminds me of that and reminds me of that and reminds me of that. So I may be a bit of a freak that way in terms of I get so much knowledge from books, but and that's why I kind of go, am I missing one?
And the reason there has not been any more recent books about that, because somebody asked me this once. Carroll Smith books were great 30 years ago, 35 years ago when they were written, right? How come no one's written a new book about that? Well, you know what? Newton's books were really good too, and no one's written any new books about that because it hasn't changed.
Yeah.
It's the fundamentals are still the fundamentals 35 or 40 years later. So because somebody asked me once if I would, to be part of writing a book about race car vehicle dynamics. And I was like, that book's already been written.
Yeah.
Like I don't have anything to add to the fundamentals. That's it. Pick them up and read them.
So, Chris, if people want to connect with you or learn more about you, how do they do that?
I'm not terribly out there like in the social media world, but I do have a website for myself. It's TCAE. It's a T Chris Andrews Enterprises LLC.com. So you can find me at TCAELLC.com. You can find me on Facebook and send me a friend request there at T Chris Andrews. Okay. And you can find me at the racetrack just about every weekend somewhere.
Yeah. Well, I'll put those links in the show notes anyways. But hey, one of these days we'll bump into each other at one of the tracks and carry on this conversation. And then I'll get you come back and tell some more stories and some cool stuff and give some great advice on a future podcast too.
Yeah, we're at the same place lots of weekends throughout the year, I'm sure.
Oh, it's funny how that works. And yeah. I always say that one of the reasons I do this podcast is so I can actually have the conversations that I never get a chance to when I'm at the track.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we're at the racetrack and we're working and we're busy, and like you see people in passing, like, hey, call me next week. Hey, how are you doing? Good. I got to go to practice. You know?
Yeah.
It's not a very social place.
Yeah.
Is it?
No.
Work.
Well, I guess it's no different than, the difference is we don't go to an office and stand around the water cooler.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, well, again, thanks, Chris. Thanks for being on the show. And I'll catch you at one of these tracks. Until then, keep having fun.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you having me on. Thanks a lot.
Whether you've been to a particular track before or it's your first time, understanding the circuit in detail is critical if you're going to be fast and smooth. Do you know where the apex is for the most critical corners? Or even what corners are the most critical? How about knowing the best places to make a pass? How about knowing exactly where the track has the most grip and where it doesn't? And what about where to find visual clues? Well, you don't have to worry. Ross and fellow coach Peter Kraus are here to help. They will take you on a video tour of a variety of tracks. They are virtual track walks. The feedback about these Speed Secrets training videos has been over the top. Experienced drivers who've been going to the same track for a decade or more say that the virtual track walk helped them shave seconds off their best ever lap times. Go to speedsecrets.com/virtual track walks to preview this amazing tool. It's a detailed resource you have to see to believe. That's speedsecrets.com/virtual track walks. Keep learning and, of course, having fun.